was with one night, everything was still. I could see my baby out on that lonesome hill.
Uncle Wade, Green River Blues. That's Andrew Revkin's band, our next guest. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President-elect Barack Obama has unveiled his nominees for top climate change and energy positions in his administration. Nobel-winning physicist Steven Chu has been tapped to serve as Energy Secretary. Lisa Jackson, Chief of Staff to New Jersey Governor Jon Corzine, will head the Environmental Protection Agency. Former EPA head Carol Browner will run a newly created White House council to oversee environmental issues. And Los Angeles Deputy Mayor Nancy Sutley will head the White House Council on Environmental Quality. At a news conference in Chicago Monday, Obama highlighted his plans to encourage innovation to address the U.S. dependency on foreign oil.
In the next few years, the choices that we make will help determine the kind of country and world that we will leave to our children and our grandchildren. All of us know the problems that are rooted in our addiction to foreign oil. It constrains our economy, shifts wealth to hostile regimes, and leaves us dependent on unstable regions. To control our own destiny, America must develop new forms of energy and new ways of using it. And this is not a challenge for government alone. It's a challenge for all of us.
Observers say while Obama's energy and environmental nominees agree that human-driven global warming poses a stark threat, there are key differences in how they think it should be addressed. Andrew Revkin, an award-winning science reporter with the New York Times, also writes the .Earth blog on the New York Times website. His latest book is called The North Pole Was Here, Puzzles and Perils at the Top of the World. He was just awarded the John Chancellor Award for Excellence in Journalism, the first science writer to win the award. Andrew Revkin joins us now in the Firehouse studio. Welcome to Democracy Now! Good to have you with us, Andrew. Can you start off by talking about these appointments now?
Sure. Well, I think this all sort of reflects President-elect Obama's this is a priority for him, even with what's going on with the economy. He's got a team here that kind of encapsulates a lot of experience, people who can talk to Congress, and Carol Browner clearly knows Washington. She spent 2 terms. She's, I think, the longest-serving EPA administrator from her Clinton years. So she knows the inside, and Dr. Steven Chu, who I've interviewed in the past about energy and climate, he knows the science, and he knows it pretty deeply, and he knows how hard it is to get sometimes an idea from a laboratory and to become the new norm for energy.
Explain who he is, where he comes from.
Well, his Nobel Prize is in pretty basic physics. It's about how to keep atoms cold and stuff like that. Stuff like my colleague Dennis Overby would write about, who writes about things that I can hardly get my head around. But in the last 5 years or so, Dr. Chu went to the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory to create, and he came there with his mandate for that lab was that energy is our new frontier. And he started to develop programs there that are very much aimed at trying to sort of have big breakthroughs on non-polluting forms of energy that we'll need as the world heads toward 9 billion people, more or less, with everyone wanting a decent life. We need more energy than we have now, even if you set aside the climate problem. But when you add the climate challenge with these building greenhouse gases, that creates this even bigger imperative. So he's got he clearly has the grounding in both the science and how the science has to translate into products. How do you interface with private sector? How do you make this all happen? So I think the combination shows some possibility of breaking through. As I think President-elect Obama said, this isn't going to be easy. It's also a sustained challenge. This is not a one-year kind of issue. It's a years-long, a decades-long kind of challenge.
And how does nuclear fit into this picture?
It wasn't mentioned yesterday, but nuclear, well, during the campaign, the President-elect did say pretty clearly that if certain hurdles can be overcome with nuclear technology, which have been persistent hurdles for decades, how do we get agreement on what to do with waste? Can you make these plants truly safe and secure? Whether those issues get traction in the next number of years, if I had to put money on it, I would doubt it. So the challenges of nuclear, of course, are also financial. You need $8 or $10 billion to build a new nuclear power plant. Even if you had community support and all that stuff, it's a big challenge.
And of course, you've got to deal with the nuclear waste, which is a so far unresolved issue, which means that nuclear industry cannot move forward unless there's tremendous government subsidy.
Yeah, well, not to mention, as I wrote, back in 2006, and we've kind of covered this for a long time. If you look at the climate challenge and you want to say, even if you were like the most gung-ho nuclear supporter, and you said that's the way we're going to attack this, you would have to build between now and 2050 about nearly 1,000 new nuclear power plants around the world. And that would just bite off about 1/12 of the anticipated growth in greenhouse gas emissions from burning coal. So even an absolute pedal to the metal enterprise with nuclear barely nibbles at the size of the challenge anyway.
I wanted to talk about this conference that just wrapped up in Poland. Obama's energy and environmental appointments came days after a major international climate conference in Poland failed to set ambitious new goals to cut greenhouse gas emissions. Wealthier nations were also accused of failing to provide enough money to help poorer countries cope with droughts and floods and rising seas. The World Wildlife Fund director, Kim Carstensen, said industrialized nations have blocked progress at the summit.
We've seen a lack of leadership among the developed countries, lack of leadership from the US because they can't lead at the moment because they're waiting for a new president. We've seen a lack of leadership from the European Union, who are not leading at the moment because they're completely inward focused, completely looking at themselves and the EU package that they agreed today.
Although the Obama transition team didn't take part in the UN summit, there was at least one connection between Poznan in Poland and Chicago. Before arriving in Poland last week, former U.S. Vice President Al Gore held a private meeting with President-elect Obama. The two discussed Obama's environmental plans and his reported intent to emphasize science in shaping policy. At the Poznan conference, Gore urged climate delegates to approve a new climate treaty next year.
You are fearful that it is too difficult to conclude this process with a new treaty by the deadline that has been established for 1 year from now in Copenhagen. I say it can be done. It must be done. Let's finish this process at Copenhagen. Don't take the pressure off. Let's make sure that we succeed.
We're joined also, in addition to Andrew Revkin of the New York Times, by Bill McKibben. He's a leading environmentalist. His 1989 book, The End of Nature, was one of the first to describe global warming as an emerging environmental crisis. His latest book is called Deep Economy, The Wealth of Communities and the Durable Future. He's just returned from Poland, where he attended the UN Climate Change Conference in Poznan, co-founder of the environmental mobilization campaign called 350.org. The number 350 refers to calls for new global target to reduce carbon dioxide levels to no more than 350 parts per million. Bill McKibben, talk about this conference in Poznan, Poland.
Well, Amy, it was, as often, a sort of drear gab fest in a lot of ways, but there were two important things that happened, both along the same lines. The politics of this, as opposed to the policy, is finally starting to change as more and more people begin to realize that we're way deeper into the climate problem than we thought. First thing that happened was that the small island nations and less developed countries of the world, the first and most vulnerable victims of climate change, sharpened their rhetoric considerably. They started talking about survivability and asking other nations, many of which complied, to sign a pledge saying that whatever they did, they would try to build a climate policy that allowed all nations of the world to survive, not to sink beneath the rising seas or the expanding deserts. I mean, we're seriously talking in the not too distant future about hauling flags down outside the UN because those countries no longer exist. That began to sharpen the rhetoric. The other thing that happened, and you didn't play this clip from Gore's speech, but it's the one that got him by far the longest and lustiest round of applause, was when he said, and this was a enormous breakthrough, that we have to start aiming for 350 parts per million CO2. That sounds like a small technical change from 450 parts per million, the current goal, but in fact, it changes every aspect of this debate. Since we're already past 350, we're at about 387 parts per million now. That's why the Arctic is melting. It means that we have to treat this as the full-on emergency that it is, not one more problem on a long list, but the absolute central keystone problem that we have to go to work on in the most impassioned way right now. Now, look, the momentum of the talks is such that they'll kind of drag on in their current form for a while. towards Copenhagen next December. But I think that the reality of the world's the reality of the physics and chemistry of the atmosphere is beginning to overtake the political reality that's been the main feature of these talks. We're going to see a much sharpened, much heightened debate with a lot more people getting a lot angrier and demanding actual change.
I should say Bill McKibben is joining us from his home by Democracy Now!